On William James, what I have for you today is my attempt to kind of squish together both of the papers on James that I've been writing. So the one that came out, which is focused on his philosophy of science, and the one that's coming out a little bit later is on his philosophy of religion. And it's all one continuous thought, but it's two separate papers, and I tried to figure out a way to explain how they go together in this talk. So I'm going to start by talking about that first paper, and that's what most of this handout is about. And then the second, if we have time, I'll talk more about the paper that's not really even sent off yet, but I feel fairly done. So if we can talk about that if people have advice on that paper. Okay, so William James is very famous for this paper. I mean, he's famous for a number of things. He wrote this psychology textbook, one of the first textbooks on psychology, before he shifted. I mean, first he was a physiologist, then he switched to being a psychologist, then he switched to being a philosopher, so he tended to jump careers quite a bit. When he became a philosopher, he wrote, he was an advocate of pragmatism, so he's famous for his papers on pragmatism, a paper called Varieties of Religious Experience, which is kind of philosophy, but also kind of psychology. And this paper, what I'm talking about today, which is called The Will to Believe, which is often sold or explained as his defense of religious faith. So introduction to philosophy courses will often have a week or a day on William James and how he gives a pragmatic defense of belief in God, that belief in God is somehow allowable on the grounds that it's beneficial to the believer, that it makes my life go well, that it somehow benefits me, not on epistemic grounds, but instead on practical benefit. Sometimes I see it as portrayed as something like, well, Pascal's saying the belief in God gets you the benefits of heaven after you die, whereas James is saying the benefits are in your current day life. And because the evidence is split either way, pragmatic reasons can give you reason to have a belief in God. I think all of that's wrong about James, at least about in The Will to Believe. So, and I know some people I've had people be very upset about challenging that sort of conception of James and his defense of religion. So I'm sorry if I'm attacking anyone's beloved interpretation of James. I see The Will to Believe as really kind of a view of science. And so I'm going to try pushing my philosophy of science, marketplace of ideas, kind of an interpretation of The Will to Believe where I think he's anticipating things that come later in the philosophy of science from Kuhn and Lakatos and Feyerabend, in particular Feyerabend. And then after I talk about how I think The Will to Believe is defending a view of how science works and connected to Kuhn, Lakatos, and Feyerabend, I'm going to try talking about how he uses it to defend God. But I think the God part is kind of not an afterthought, because I do think that's important to him, but like it's defending a certain conception of inquiry and how inquiry works. So his belief in God has a place in that, in the way that inquiry works. Okay, enough anticipatory remarks. Looking at the handout I brought you, I've always done PowerPoints for talks, but I've always loved people who brought handouts instead. So I'm trying to be a handout person now. So William James in The Will to Believe, and I think James writes The Will to Believe several times. Like he wrote, I think the first draft is a paper he wrote, which was published in French, so people kind of didn't read it. And then if you read The Sentiment of Rationality, he's kind of struggling with the same ideas. So you kind of see the same argument crop up a lot. So focusing just on The Will to Believe, if you're trying to interpret James's Will to Believe, I think is maybe a mistake, because looking at the other places where he explores the same idea is important. But in The Will to Believe, specifically the way he structures this paper and this way of presenting his argument, is he's attacking a philosopher named W.K. Clifford, a philosopher and scientist. And Clifford had just written a paper called The Ethics of Belief, where Clifford had argued that it is wrong everywhere and for everyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. He takes this very strong stand that you have a moral obligation, I think epistemic, but also moral obligation to proportion your beliefs to evidence. He gives this example of a ship owner who's worried that his ship is not very seaworthy, but he convinces himself that God will take care of everything and that the ship has sailed many times and I'm sure it will be fine. And then the ship sails, from England to America and sinks, and everyone dies. And Clifford says this person is, is guilty of murder for believing something he didn't have the right, the epistemic right, the evidence for. And every time you believe something without sufficient evidence, you're putting people at risk. Because you're not ensuring that you have the evidence to think that that's true. James wants to attack Clifford, and really not just Clifford, but there was a whole group of philosophers and scientists at the time who were saying, attacking religion in general and arguing for believing in some sort of atheistic science that was deterministic, and that we can replace religion with Darwin and evolution, and that religion is, there were public intellectuals attacking religion and praising science, and Clifford was among them. And James, in this paper, just takes Clifford as his example, but in other works, he's used other people in the same group. And James starts by saying, by saying something he thinks is a way of agreeing with Clifford's basic idea. James says, when it comes to epistemology or our epistemic duties, we have these two duties: believe truth and avoid error. And I think this is a consequentialist view of our epistemic duties, right? It's not the deontological duty to proportion your beliefs to evidence, but it's to maximize the number of true beliefs you have and minimize the number of false beliefs you have. And James thinks, well, I think Clifford's getting at that. He's concerned that what we should be trying to do is have true beliefs and not have false beliefs. So maybe he thinks that what comes from that is that when you don't have evidence either way, you should suspend belief because they might be false. Okay. So when you have these two duties, believe truth, avoid error, if I just had the duty to believe truth, I would just believe everything I possibly could, because it might be true and it doesn't matter that it's false. But I have the other duty too, to avoid falsehood. So it means that when I have evidence that something's probably true, I should believe it. When I have evidence that something's probably false, I should disbelieve it. Well, what happens when I don't have evidence either way, right? It's not clear that I want to believe it because maybe it's true and that would satisfy my obligation to believe truth. It might be false, so if I'm risking believing something false if I believe something without sufficient evidence. So what do these two duties give me when it comes to when the evidence is unclear about what's true or what's false? Practical interpretations of James's will to believe read him in one of the following three ways. So the first way that some authors read James here is they say, well, when you have a duty to believe truth, you should believe things you have evidence for. When you have a duty to avoid error, that means you should wait for evidence that you can, or not believe things when you have evidence against them. But when the evidence is split either way, your epistemic duties are silent, right? You can believe or not believe because your epistemic duty doesn't tell you what to do. When our evidence fails to point in either direction, these dual epistemic duties, the right believe truth and avoid error, are silent about what we ought to do. Consequently, we possess the right to believe on any basis. So here the claim is, you're not violating your epistemic duties because you don't have any. You only have epistemic duties when there is evidence for or evidence against. When the evidence is balanced, or you have no evidence either way, you have no epistemic duty to suspend belief. You have no epistemic duties. So believe on whatever basis you want, right? I'm going to call this the right to believe interpretation. And I have a passage here, a quote from just somebody who reads James that way. We don't have to look at that interpretation. So on this interpretation, really it kind of just leaves you to believe on your own passional basis, or because what's beneficial to you, or because it's what you were raised to believe. Any sort of basis can fill in that gap. Another practical interpretation of James, which I'll call the James's wager interpretation, is somewhat similar. It says, yeah, there is this gap, right? Our epistemic duties are to believe truth and to avoid falsehood. So when the evidence is balanced, or when there is no evidence either way, our epistemic duties are silent, and so instead practical reason steps in. And so it's not that you are left with no duties, it's just that practical reason has a say in what you should believe or shouldn't believe. So on this interpretation, it builds on the gap in a believer's epistemic duties identified by the right to believe interpretation. However, this interpretation additionally contends that practical rationality steps in to determine what an agent should believe whenever theoretical rationality leaves it undetermined. Okay. And then there's one last practical interpretation of James's will to believe. These are the three sorts that I think are common that I want to say. I want to reject all three of them. And this one says, well, James has this theory of truth that he advocates for later in life, where he says, what's true is what's beneficial to believe. And if what's true is what's beneficial to believe, then you can just kind of get his doctrine really quick. You can just say, oh, well, believing in God makes me happy and makes my life go well and lets me work well with my society, then it must be true, right? If you just define truth as what's useful, then the doctrine kind of falls out very easily. You don't even need to talk about this believe truth, avoid error stuff. You can just say that my theory of truth says that if this is practically useful, then it becomes true. Why does James have this theory of truth? I don't know how familiar you are with his pragmatist theory of truth, but one of the ways he frames it when he introduces it later in life, which I find nice, is he says, he's attacking this correspondence theory of truth. He says, what does it mean to say my belief corresponds with reality? Does it picture it? What about beliefs that aren't pictures? What about beliefs about how the world works that isn't so pictorial? So he said this connection between how there's something in my head can match or correspond to the world that people, when they use the word correspondence to define truth, he finds that somewhat mysterious, and he says, I think that the way my beliefs can match the world is that my belief leads me to actions, and when those actions lead me to success, it's cohering with the world, right? The correspondence between beliefs and the world is mediated through our actions. And so that leads him to this sort of pragmatist theory of truth, where he's saying what's useful is true because, working in the world, practical success does mean the belief is somehow matching the world, correctly connecting up with the world. Okay. So these are these three interpretations of James's doctrine, which really focus on the practical benefits of the belief. And I want to say I don't think any of these are correct interpretations of James's will to believe. I do think he has that theory of truth, but I think that's a separate doctrine that he advocates later in life and doesn't necessarily. He wants this doctrine, what he's arguing for here, to stand independent of his theory of truth. So on my interpretation, I'm going to give an epistemic interpretation of James's will to believe. I think what James is up to here is that he argues that there exists a certain class of beliefs for which their truth, or evidence of their truth, if they are true, would only become available after we believe them, and therefore waiting to believe until we have sufficient evidence would be a self-defeating wait. So the idea here, he's talking about believe truth, avoid error. He says, yeah, well, I'm trying to maximize my true beliefs and minimize my false ones, so if I have the evidence that it's probably true, I should believe it. If I have evidence that it's false, I shouldn't believe it. If I don't have evidence either way, I should go get the evidence because I'm trying to maximize true beliefs. So the first thing I should do if I don't have sufficient evidence is go gather it. And maybe if I can't get evidence either way, I should suspend belief. But he says there are cases where I need to believe first, and that brings the evidence later. Or I need to believe first, and it makes the thing true. So it's not a disconcern for truth. It's not a unconcern for evidence, but instead this idea that there are certain beliefs that give you access to either the truth of the belief or the evidence for the belief. I'll give some examples in a little bit. Okay. So just some reasons to believe this interpretation of James. And maybe this is not super interesting, so I won't go I'll go a little quick. Well, I'll go through this a little quickly because I'm just sort of giving you passages of James and trying to convince you that I'm reading him right, but maybe people aren't super concerned with whether this is the correct interpretation of James, and I'll get to the interesting part in a little bit. But first off, I think the practical interpretations have to be wrong because James just makes a lot of explicit statements where he says it's not just that the belief makes you feel good, it's that you somehow contribute to the belief being true. Now, I think it also needs to be you can contribute to the evidence of the belief coming in. So he says things like this. He says, the future movements of the stars or facts of past history are determined now once and for all, whether I like them or not. They are given irrespective of my wishes, and in all that concerns truths like these, subjective preference should have no part. it can only obscure the judgment. But in every fact into which there enters an element of personal contribution on my part, how terribly asinine would it be for me to deny myself the method of belief based on desire? So he says, in the class of beliefs where somehow my personal contribution affects their truth, it's okay to believe on desire, on faith. So he's restricting the class to somehow the facts which I have a role in either making true. So what is this element of personal contribution? Well, one class of beliefs that James talks about is self-fulfilling beliefs. And he gives lots of very specific examples of this. So if you look, I have this long paragraph here. All the ones that are not bolded, I think, are clear examples of self-fulfilling beliefs. So first, we shall fail or we shall not fail. So he thinks that, like, whether I will fail or not, if I believe that I won't fail, that contributes to its own belief. It's not true or false. Somehow my belief can make it true that we won't fail. So he thinks that that's a violation of this Clifford's evidentialism that he thinks is justified, right? Because the belief contributes to the belief's own truth, and it can't be true unless I believe it first. So there's other examples. I can make this jump. I can't make this jump. My efforts will keep this boat afloat. My efforts won't keep this boat afloat. I will get this promotion. I won't get this promotion. So he has all these sorts of examples where he says, evidentialism, if you follow Clifford and say, I can't believe something until I have evidence that it's true, you cut yourself off from all of these activities, successes that require you believing in yourself first. So when your personal contribution, the sort of having the belief ahead of time, gives you the motivation, gives you the confidence to act in ways that make it true, he thinks that that's a justified faith. That's a justified case of believing without evidence, because there's no point in waiting for the evidence. In fact, waiting for the evidence just makes it false. Okay. But what about these bolded ones? I have some bolded examples here. They don't seem like self-fulfilling beliefs. So I have life is worth living. Maybe that is self-fulfilling, like you believing. But the world is good. The world isn't good. Free acts are possible. Free acts are not possible. Maybe those are self-fulfilling, maybe they aren't, but some of these ones towards the bottom definitely don't seem self-fulfilling. Nature is intelligible. Nature is uniform. The existence of primordial units of mind stuff. I think he's talking about panpsychism here. Darwinian evolution, the theory of kinetic constitution of matter, the existence of immortality, the existence of God, these don't seem like things that I make true by believing them, right? God doesn't come into existence because I believe in him. Darwinian evolution is not true because I don't make that true. So some of his examples just don't fit the claim that that faith is justified only in cases where you make the belief true through having the belief. Some of them seem like a different sort of case. And I think that all of these bold examples, maybe some of them are self-fulfilling. Sometimes James talks about the idea that you have free will is self-fulfilling because you won't be motivated to take free actions unless you believe you're free. So maybe some of these bolded ones are self-fulfilling in some sort of weird way that James thinks, but some of these are definitely not. And I think the ones that are not are what I'll call evidence-accessing beliefs, right? So they're beliefs that waiting for evidence means the evidence will never come. It might be true, but we would never have access to its truth. We would never have access to that evidence of their truth unless I believe first. So one example of that would be, let's look at, Darwinian evolution. I think this is an example of an evidence-accessing belief. He thinks that if Darwinian evolution is true, we would never know it unless we believed it first unjustifiably. Why is that the case? I'll come to that, right? Okay. So I think, well, I guess to preview it, the claim here is something like there are these grand research programs, these big hypotheses that take a lot of time and a lot of resources in order to gather the data, to follow through on the chase down the leads, to respond to objections, to commit your career to trying to hold up and see if there's any truth to this theory. And he thinks that there's no way of us doing that unless someone's believing first, right? The way you find out that Darwinian evolution is true is that someone like Darwin or some of his coworkers are like, I have a hunch that this is right, and I'm going to commit this has to be how it works. I know I only have this couple pieces of suggestive evidence. I know it actually contradicts quite a few things we know about the world, but I have a hunch, I believe in my soul that this is right. And so he thinks that that's how science works and makes progress in general, and that, so the idea that we should be only believing when we have sufficient evidence would undermine one of the core key steam engines that drives the progress of science, right? He thinks we would never get things like, I mean, he thinks the uniformity of nature is a broad underpinning thought, like assumption that all of science is built on, right? We just sort of take it on faith, and then we try to understand the world under that assumption. And if we reach success, then that sort of confirms our belief that nature is uniform. Same thing for any sort of broad, general scientific theory. Okay. So I don't think my interpretation of James here is entirely original, although it's slightly different. So I want to give somebody who gives a similar one, and then I'll talk more about the way I read him. So there's a guy named, a philosopher named William James Earl. Fittingly, I'm assuming his father was a big fan of William James, and he didn't write a lot on William James. He's still alive. I was looking at it, I was checking to see if he had wrote anything else on William James that I had missed, but at some point he wrote the encyclopedia entry on William James in the Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Back before we had the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that we all used, there was this nice, like in the 2000s and the 90s, there's this one you check out at the library that had very nice entries on philosophy by, I think the editor was Paul Edwards. Anyway, he wrote the entry on William James, and he gave in that entry an interpretation of James which I think was very similar to the one that I want to give, and not pragmatic, not the sort of practical interpretations that I'm challenging. But I think he gets it slightly wrong. So he proposes an interpretation of the will to believe where he thinks that James is taking sides in a certain debate in the philosophy of science. At the time, this debate was kind of dying out. It had kind of roared up for a while and it died out. It was almost dead. People had kind of settled it by this point. But it was a debate between Baconian inductivism versus hypothetical deductivism. So Bacon's theory of how science proceeds was very anti-hypothesis. Right? The idea that if you had a guess about how the world worked, and that's what you made that guess first, and then you gathered evidence to test whether your hypothesis was true. He thought that would bias science, that involves a subjective element that guides your research and leads you to unscientific, biased results. So the way that Bacon thought science should work, this sort of Baconian inductivism, is you just went out into the world with no clue. You're like, I wonder what heat is. Let's just go investigate every phenomena that involves heat. So you're like, oh, corpses, when someone dies, they lose heat at this rate. The sun feels warm even though it's really far away, right? So you just make this long list of 200 things that involve heat, and then you look at the list and you try to figure out what the common factor behind all of them are, right? I gather my data without a hypothesis, I get a big long list, and then I try to derive from that list the sort of underpinning factor that might explain the phenomena of heat in all of these cases. So we don't do science that way, right? When we teach the scientific method in junior high or in high school, we say that you have a problem and the first thing you do is you make a guess, right? And then you derive possible predictions from your hypothesis, and then you go and check. At the time, that was, advocates of Baconian inductivism thought that was unscientific. It's hard to imagine doing science without doing it that way, right? Like, how would we come about building giant telescopes to check one very specific prediction of Einsteinian relativity, right? Like we already have an image of how we think the world works, and we go and do to great lengths to test the hypothesis we already have. It seems hard to imagine we could make progress by just randomly investigating phenomena in the world. So at the time, people had kind of already fallen on the side of hypothetical deductivism, that using hypotheses in science was okay, except for Darwin had kind of reignited it. Because one of the people who were attacking Darwinian evolution as a theory was saying that they're like, that's a hypothesis, he's just sort of guessing, that's not legitimate in science. Like it actually conflicts with certain things we know about the world. He's not just deriving it from the evidence, he's sort of doing something that actually is contrary to some of the evidence. some of the evidence that was against Darwinian evolution at the time, for example, the sun was way too young for evolution to have had time to take place, because we didn't know about nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. So our best guesses about how the sun was fueled would have made it far, far younger than we think of it as being now. So in any case, so some people were reigniting this debate between Baconian deductivism and hypothetical deductivism in science as a way to attack Darwinian evolution. And so the way Earle interprets James is he's taking sides in that debate. He's defending, among other things, Darwinian evolution. The hypotheses are okay. So here's, these are not, I don't have a quote from Earle here. I don't think that this is the debate that James is trying to get into. And I don't think this is the debate that James is trying to get into, because he very explicitly says, my doctrine does not apply to just hypotheses. One problem is that Clifford and Huxley and all these scientists that he's attacking, they love evolution, right? And they love hypotheses. So it's a little weird that he's arguing with them with something that they agree about. And then it's also weird that James would then just sort of explicitly say, I don't mean hypotheses. So here's a passage from The Will to Believe. He says, we don't need to use the will to believe. My doctrine doesn't apply to trivial claims. An option is trivial when the opportunity is not unique, when the stake is insignificant, or when the decision is reversible if it later prove unwise. Such trivial options are abound in scientific life. A chemist finds a hypothesis live enough to spend a year in its verification. He believes it to that extent, but his experiments prove inconclusive either way. He is quit for his loss of time, no vital harm being done. The only difference between hypotheses is that while some hypotheses can be refuted in 5 minutes, others may defy ages. A chemist who conjectures that certain wallpaper contains arsenic has faith enough to lead him to take the trouble to put some of it in a hydrogen bottle and finds out by the results of his action whether he was right or wrong. But theories like that of Darwin or that of the kinetic constitution of matter may exhaust the labors of generations in their cooperation. Each tester takes their truth proceeding in this simple way, that he acts as if it were true and expects the result to disappoint him if his assumption is false. The longer the disappointment is delayed, the stronger his faith in his theory. So here he's talking about, I think he's making a distinction between just mere hypotheses and what in another place he calls theoretically wide hypotheses. So the theoretical wideness, I think, is important. And in fact, I think this is James's term for what we would later want to call either a paradigm or a research program. I like this. I'm going to read this one more paragraph here, if you'll forgive me reading directly from James, because I really love this, because I think this is the best example. He's actually attacking Clifford for violating his own doctrine and believing something without sufficient evidence. He calls it conscious automaton theory, which, as far as I can tell, is just a really old-timey word for epiphenomenalism. So epiphenomenalism in philosophy of mind is the view that the brain causes conscious mental states, but the conscious mental states have no causal powers, right? They're just a epiphenomenon. They're an after effect of the activity of the physical world, but they can't in turn affect the physical world. So he goes, why does Clifford fearlessly proclaim his belief in the conscious automaton theory, although the proofs before him are the same which make Mr. Lewis reject it? Why does he believe in primordial units of mind stuff on evidence which would seem worthless to Professor Bain? Simply because, like every human being of the slightest mental originality, he is peculiarly sensitive to evidence that bears in some one direction. It is utterly hopeless to try to exercise such sensitivities by calling it the disturbing subjective factor. Every philosopher or man of science either, whose initiative counts for anything in the evolution of thought, has taken his stand on a sort of dumb conviction that truth must lie in one direction rather than another, and a sort of preliminary assurance that his notion can be made to work, and has borne his best fruit in trying to make it work. These mental instincts in different men are the spontaneous variations which upon the intellectual struggle for evidence is based. So this last line, spontaneous variations upon which the intellectual struggle for existence is based. I think James is making attempting a strong metaphor with Darwinian evolution here. He thinks that the way that science proceeds is not by proportioning belief to evidence and only following where the evidence leads. He thinks it proceeds by variations in intellectual temperament, right? You might find modal realism an attractive theory. You might think it's silly. You might have a different thought. And then each of you kind of have faith that you're on the right track, and you all proceed in your different directions. And then in the end, we get sophisticated arguments for each, sophisticated objections to each, maybe evidence for one or the other. And we wouldn't get that if all of us just forced ourselves to only proceed by what we can move towards with evidence that we have at the moment, right? He thinks any sort of big scientific advancement takes stupid, dumb luck, I'll say, variations in our intellectual temperaments. Okay, so James insists that these sorts of long-term hypotheses do violate, I guess I'm calling it the agnostic imperative. That's the sort of claim that Clifford says being agnostic when the evidence is insufficient. And he criticizes philosophers like Clifford for denying them a place in scientific inquiry. These are the sorts of hypotheses which I think we today call Kuhnian paradigms or Lakatosian research programs. James at one place calls them wide theoretical conclusions. So, Kuhn is, he's a historian of science. He does all this really deep research about how the Copernican revolution came about and various events in science. And he says he gives us this rich scientific theory of how there's normal science and then sometimes revolutionary science where the paradigms shift. So I don't want to say like James said it before Kuhn, because Kuhn did a lot more than just like come up with this idea that we have these sorts of unjustified paradigms which scientists are working under. But James does have this same idea that science depends upon kind of this broader structural framework that we adopt on faith, and that's borne out later on, right? That there are these little small hypotheses, I guess what Kuhn would call normal science, that we do. But normal science is always in the context of some broader, so Darwinian evolution, I adopt it as a paradigm. The working scientists are testing a bunch of smaller hypotheses. If that whole paradigm starts to collapse, doesn't start to make sense, the sort of predictions it makes, then we might move on to another one. But our initial adoption of that paradigm, he thinks, was where you get a large number of people working with it and proceeding under it and working out its details and testing it, was not justified originally by sufficient evidence to even think that it was probably the case. Okay. So scientific progress works through Darwinian evolution and natural selection of ideas by all of us having random variations in what hunches we take to be plausible, how we weigh evidence, what sort of philosophical, rationalistic a priori principles we take for granted. So he thinks some people assume determinism, other people assume determinism is false. That's an important feature that we don't have sufficient evidence to say either way. So just to give an example, right? In quantum mechanics today, you have collapse theories of quantum mechanics and no collapse theories. No collapse theories of the wave function, they're deterministic. Collapse theories are indeterministic. You can imagine that people might be working in either one of those research programs based partially on the thought that the universe has to be deterministic, or people being okay that the universe might not be deterministic. And James says that's the sort of intellectual variation that we need in the sciences to make any sort of progress. And which one is, and we're not going to have justification beforehand whether determinism holds or not. Okay, I don't know how, so then I was going to talk about how, that clock isn't working.
No, you have time, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
I just have no idea what time it is.
yeah, it has been like 30 minutes.
Okay, so, all right, so that's, let me just say one more thing about his philosophy of science and how I think it connects to sort of recent stuff, and then I'm going to move on to how God shows up into all of this. Because the whole thing, the will to believe is famously James's defense of belief in God, and I have talked very, very little about God. So I want to talk about that next. But how I really think so Kuhn, right? He has this idea that, I don't know how familiar people are with Kuhn. There are these that for science to proceed, eventually, you first need to get sort of a paradigm which the physicists are working under, or the biologists are working under, which is sort of a broad understanding of how the world works with assumptions about how you evaluate theories. So there's like the standards of what's a good theory or a bad theory, sort of basic framework picture of the world, right? Which then sets the ability for different working scientists to go like spend their whole lives just solving tiny problems. Like, I'm just going to try figuring out. So I have as my paradigm the atomic theory of matter. I spend my life just trying to figure out the melting point of various metals and to test some salts. So he calls normal science what most scientists do. What most of science is people just going about working within a background assumption that you pick up when you go to grad school. You learn the broad theory that the broad paradigm we're working under currently, and then you go about doing some sort of testing specific hypotheses. But sometimes that broad paradigm starts to break down, and then we enter a period of that he calls revolutionary science, where crazy ideas start getting thrown out. There are still people probably doing normal science, but you start getting scientists who read philosophy. They start challenging basic assumptions that they start realizing that, well, maybe we could throw out determinism. Maybe there can be action at a distance. Maybe the orbits of the planets don't need to be perfect spheres, right? The sort of background assumptions that we were working under when you're doing normal science, you throw those out and you start to experiment with entirely different models of the world. So you have like the move from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, the Copernican revolution. Now, after Kuhn, there was a philosopher named Lakatos, one of his students, who revises Kuhn's theory in a way, and instead of talking about paradigms, he talks about research programs. And research programs kind of fill that same niche but instead of having just one overarching paradigm for all of physics, you have different teams doing specific research programs. So do you adopt so you might think multi-world theory of quantum mechanics, that's a research program. Copenhagen interpretations, that's a research program. In philosophy, modal idealism is a research program, right? We have all of these sorts of, you sort of adopt a sort of background picture of how all this works with some basic assumptions, and then you proceed trying to solve maybe some small problems, like respond to objections for Kantian ethics. I suppose I'm on the Kantian ethicist research program, and I'm trying to, I think it's true. I might be wrong. I'm not like 100% confident, but I don't just work under it as a hypothesis. I actually do think I have a hunch that this is the right way for ethics to go. And I try to fix some of the arguments that don't seem to work all that well. I try to extend it to some further problems. I try to respond to some objections from the other side and criticize the other side, right? So I'm working in that sort of research program. There are other people working in the utilitarian research program. There's other people working in the sort of virtue ethicist research program. But Lakatos sort of defines how science should proceed. He says, he gives a definition of a degenerative research program. The way is that you should notice that your research program is hitting so many problems it should be abandoned, and you should switch to another one. And in opposition to that, there's a philosopher named Fyfe who says, no. We should just let all the research programs run free. He's an anarchist about scientific methodology. The idea that we should have that you can judge a research program as either going well or going. We should leave it to people's their own reasons, their own biases, their own subjective decisions about whether they want to work in a research program or not, right? So, and I think that's James's sort of picture here, that you can't try to wrangle science and say this research program is going well, this one's not, we should cut its funding and tell these people that it's time for them to move on, right? He thinks, no, you get smart people, you fund them to go in the directions that they want to go in. He actually is a huge, I think temperamentally, he just hates the idea of academia, like the scholarly community telling you what ideas you should have or shouldn't have, or trying to evaluate them for you. So at the time when he was a physiologist, that was a discipline that was under attack. It was a very young discipline. The chemists were saying, how could you possibly study chemical reactions in the whole human body? That's way too complex. Physiology could never be a science. Doctors were attacking it. I got this great speech in one of my footnotes
where the president of Harvard's medical school is saying, why do we have these stupid physiology classes? Doctors should be studying medicine, not like chemistry, right? So James, his first field when he starts out is a scientific field that people think shouldn't be there. And I think he thinks, just give it some time, give it some breathing room. Let's not strangle this. Then he goes to psychology. Similar story. Psychology was also a young science that people were attacking and thought shouldn't exist. He then also defends parapsychology, right? He thinks that he's on the editor board of I don't know if he's like the editor or just on the board, but he's very involved with the journal of like speculative parapsychology, where they're testing whether people have ESP or they can talk to the dead. So he's got 2 hits and then 1 miss, I think. But again, psychologists are criticizing James for embarrassing them, right? They're like, we have enough trouble trying to defend our field as a real science, and you're over there trying to defend ghosts. Please cut it out, James. He also, not even just whole scientific fields, he's this huge patron saint of weird quacks, right? I don't know if you guys also get emails from people telling you, like, I've proven Kant wrong, or here's Einstein. Like, people who, they write to you because your name's on a university website as a philosopher. James responded to them. He gets those letters. He's a public in life, and he writes back. He quotes them. He invites them to come give talks. So he doesn't like the idea that people's ideas are being rejected as not worthy, and not just because it's disrespecting them. He thinks that it's intellectually wrong, right? That it's not the way that science should progress. It should be much more open to think. I mean, today I think it would be things like natural medicine, maybe even climate denial. I mean, some things that are good and some things that we would not be happy about, but like climate deniers, he'd say, like, I can't prejudge whether that sort of approach is right or wrong. We should make sure that we have people, if there are people who believe in it, smart people who believe in it adamantly, we should make room for them in academia to pursue their hunch. He also, most famously, I think, Charles Sanders Peirce, who is a very famous pragmatist and did a lot of work on logic and philosophy of language. He was rejected by academia. I'm not exactly sure why. He spent his life working in a U.S. Geological Survey office. He didn't really publish much. He wasn't very well known. I think some of it might have been his personality. Something about also people not liking his wife. So I don't exactly know why Peirce had such a hard time making it. But James funded his life, right? We probably wouldn't have, so he thought that Peirce's ideas were great. He popularized them, he talked about them a lot. He even, out of his pocket, paid for a lot of Peirce's expenses. So much so that Charles Sanders Peirce changes his name towards the end of his life. So he's Charles Sanders Peirce to C.S. Peirce. He adds Santiago. So it's Charles Sanders Santiago Peirce, and Santiago means St. James. So he adds, for James, saving his life and enabling him to be a scholar, right? So I think it's just all part of James's kind of thought that the way that intellectual progress is made is this openness, and is sort of taking it as his mortal enemy, the idea of prejudging whose ideas are on the right track and whose are not. Okay, so how does this get us to God? So I have these passages here at the end where how do we make sense of James's belief? Well, so one way you might interpret, how does God or research, how does my defense of research programs in academia apply to people's religious beliefs? One way you might interpret James is he's only defending the religious belief of scholars. He's only defending the existence of the theology department and religious philosophers and religious scientists having the right to pursue. You might read him that way. And here's the first passage here. It kind of points to that direction, where he says, my article, The Will to Believe, my paper wasn't addressed to mankind at large, but to a limited set of studious persons badly under the ban just now of certain authorities whose simple-minded faith in naturalism also is sorely in need of an airing, and an airing, as it seems to me, of the sort. So he's like, I'm just attacking these scientists and academics who are attacking other academics for following up on religious studies. I think that that's true about The Will to Believe. I think that talk was too a
community who was very atheistic, very scientific, and so he sort of took on an adversarial,
like he was trying to convince them that religion had a place in science. But I think he also wanted to defend ordinary people's religious beliefs. So I don't think that we should read James as only defending faith for scholars and academics. This next passage, I find this one strange. Maybe this is connected to his pragmatist theory of truth. But here he says, this is not in The Will to Believe, but The Will to Believe as a lecture is published a year later, and he writes a preface. And in the preface, he adds this passage where he says, if religious hypotheses about the universe be in order at all, then the active faiths of individuals in them, freely expressing themselves in life, are the experimental tests by which they are verified, and the only means by which their truth or falsehood can be wrought out. The truest scientific hypothesis is that which we say works best, and it can be no otherwise with religious hypotheses. Religious history proves that one hypothesis after another has worked ill and has crumbled in contact with a widening knowledge about the world and has lapsed from the minds of men. Some articles of faith, however, have maintained themselves through every vicissitude and possess even more vitality today than ever before. The freest competition of the various faiths with one another and their openest application to life by their several champions are the most favorable conditions under which the survival of the fittest can proceed. So here he seems to think, so I like to use my example as my mother, right? My mother is not a scholar. She's not an academic. She's not doing research on like how does quantum mechanics relate to like religious belief. She's just an ordinary religious believer. How is her belief, religious belief, justified by James's talk about self-fulfilling or evidence accessing beliefs? I think he's trying to make that work. He's trying to say something like we need, like the way you test or see whether religious beliefs are successful or not is through these religious communities of ordinary believers. I find that epistemology of how you verify faith implausible. But here I think but what I think he's kind of doing here is he's thrashing about trying to find a way to fit religious belief in his account. Right? His account is belief in God needs to be self-fulfilling, so my belief in him needs to make him exist, which is unlikely, or it needs to give me access to God's evidence that God exists. So one possibility is saying, well, belief in God does give us access to evidence he exists through or if he does exist, through scholars, but he wants to extend that to ordinary believers. So here's an attempt to extend it to ordinary believers. He says, well, the way we know the evidence of whether God exists or not, or what religion is true or not, is through whether this community of believers is being successful in life, and their sort of way of life seems to match as modern technologies arise, as wars happen, as the world changes, as we understand the world differently. Their religion seems to be working all the better and spreading and leading to success, whereas this religion seems to be dying out because the way of life that they sort of prescribed as the right one doesn't seem to actually match how things are going. So that's, I think, one way in which James tries to do it. There's another passage here. James, just as a man who in the company of gentlemen made no advances, asked a warrant for every concession, and believed no one's word without proof, would cut himself off by such churlishness from all the social rewards that a more trusting spirit would earn, so here one should shut himself up in snarling logicality and try to make the gods extort his recognition willy-nilly, or not get it at all, might cut himself off forever from his only opportunity of making the gods' acquaintance. So here he's saying something like, unless you're open to God, God's not going to reveal himself to you or herself or itself to you, right? So that's just another way in which he's trying to say that maybe it's evidence accessing, right? That belief comes first and that gives you evidence of God's existence. This last passage, not the last passage, the fourth passage, he says, we feel too as if the appeal of religion to us were made to our own active goodwill, as if the evidence might forever be withheld from us unless we meet the hypothesis halfway. This feeling forced on us, we know not whence, that by obstinately believing that there are gods, although not to do so would be so easy both for our logic and our life, we are doing the universe the deepest service we can, seems part of the living essence of the religious hypothesis. If the hypothesis were true in all its parts, including this one,
then pure intellectualism with its veto on our making willing advances would be an absurdity, and some participation of our sympathetic nature would be logically required. I think this maybe is the most truthful or accurate portrayal of James's real thinking. He says, I don't know why, but for some reason it just seems like religion and God, if it's true, the only way we're going to know is if we believe first. It seems like faith is not just an accidental feature of God and religious belief. It seems built into the very idea, the very hypothesis as it appeals to me, that it's the sort of hypothesis that I'm not going to be able to know if it's true, or we won't know it's true unless he says, meet it halfway. And then these earlier passages, 1, 2, and 3, I think are kind of him trying to figure, he's offering various ways it might work. Maybe it's because we test it through the religious communities, either succeeding or failing. Maybe it's because God only reveals himself to people who believe. But in any case, I think he just has this hunch, right? It's part of the worldview, the broad paradigm or research program he wants to work under. And it's one among many. He thinks that Clifford's is another one. He's like, Clifford, it's great. You should go be a determinist. You should go be an epiphenomenalist. We'll find out if you're right, and be an atheist. If we'll find out if you're right through in the future, whether your arguments start to get better, whether you're able to respond to all of the objections, whether you're going to be able to gather evidence. We'll see if your research program works out. My research program includes a God, and he thinks a limited God. So he's a finite God. He doesn't think God is all powerful. He ultimately thinks it's a God that somehow needs my help and needs me to believe in him. And if I believe in him and try to do good in the world, somehow we're making the world a better place. And it's really important to God that I do that. Like that's the kind of like the picture that he has. And I think it's sort of just offered as another research program. I don't think he means for it to be justified on practical grounds, but instead justified as sort of part of his hunch about how the world works. The last passage, I think, is the most strange way in which James tries to fit God into his justifications. He says, once more, it may be a case of maybes, and once more, maybes are the essence of the situation. I confess that I do not see why the very essence of an invisible world may not in part depend on the personal response which any one of us may take to the religious appeal. God himself, in short, may draw vital strength and increase of very being from our fidelity. So here he's like, well, maybe God's even self-fulfilling. His existence depends upon our beliefs. Okay. So what does this all come to? I think that the practical interpretations of James are wrong, right? The three theories I looked at first, which said the reason James is justifying, the way that James is justifying belief in God is, well, the evidence is balanced either way, so believe what makes you happy. Believe what's beneficial to you, right? I think that's the wrong way to read the will to believe. I think James instead thinks that there's a very specific class of beliefs where you can have a justified faith ahead of time. One is self-fulfilling beliefs, and one is these evidence-accessing beliefs, which I think gets into his view of how he thinks science works. And then we find, I think, James just trying to fit God into that very restrictive view of when faith is justified. So he's trying to make God either self-fulfilling or the sort of thing that you get evidence for after you believe. It's not just that he doesn't say God is beneficial to believe, that it's pragmatically useful. In fact, he said, if God's existence doesn't somehow depend, and the evidence for him doesn't depend on me believing first, then I think he would think it's an unjustified faith. So he has to somehow convey or say his faith, at least the sort of justified faith, has to be the sort of faith that's requires belief before it's true or belief before the evidence becomes available. So I don't find James's religious defense all that interesting. I do find the stuff about the philosophy of science kind of interesting. I mean, in some sense, he's not offering us something new, because I think the ideas that James is putting forth about science are very similar or anticipate stuff from Kuhn, Lakatos, and in particular Feyerabend. But I think it's interesting that James is ahead of them along a good ways. And I think it's a more correct interpretation of what he was getting at in his defense of religious belief. He's trying to defend it on the basis of how he sees human inquiry to progress through faith first. Okay. That.
Thank you. You will take some questions now.
Sure.
Anyone? Veda.
I'm wondering the process between believing and finding the evidence of truth.
Yeah.
Like you are saying that, and you are saying that. Sounds like evidence needs in belief, 100% belief first. But like, what's between them? How does it?
Good. I mean, so he thinks that is your question? I could use. I'm trying to pick an example here. I could either do me and Kantian ethics. I could do me and, or we could do a scientist with like quantum mechanics. We could do James and God. But I think the idea here is that it takes enormous levels of commitment, right? Like I have to just devote my career to this. I have to engage with it in a way that isn't just a day job. He thinks that it requires passionate believers to really try to develop multi-world theory in quantum mechanics, right? Multi-world theory thinks that what quantum mechanics is describing is it's not that electrons at two places at the same time, it's that there are these different parallel universes and they're slowly splitting, right? He thinks that the people who work on that and are making progress on that actually think it's the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics, and the other people with the other interpretations are wrong, and that they're defending it with the sort of psychological motivation, psychological eagerness, vitality of a true believer, right? And so the way we get developed arguments for that theory, developed objections, the alternatives, the sort of creative pursuit of the experiments that might one day reveal whether it's correct or not, is only going to come from somebody who's devoted their career to it and done so with true belief, I suppose. You might think that there are people who work in science who aren't true believers, right? It's just their day job. I'm just writing this paper on multi-world theory. I don't know if it's true or not, but I thought of this interesting argument for or against it. So it's not clear that everybody working on it needs to have faith in it being true. But James seems to think that science could not progress unless we have a good number of people who believe something before we have the right to think that it's even likely to be true.
So it's like a random chance if you had a hunch or not. Like, because there's not certainty in this.
Yeah.
If your belief is the truth or like error. So if you just either you have a hunch to do this or not.
Yeah. So think about the analogy or the metaphor, the analogy with Darwinian evolution, right? So you have random variations, and one seems to promote their fitness or their ability to reproduce, and because of that they have more children, and then that trait tends to spread, right? So none of the random variations are arbitrary. There's no reason to think any of them is going to be successful. I think he thinks here the same sort of thing, that we all sort of have random variations in our intellectual temperaments. Like, I tend to think that sacrificing one person to save many seems really morally objectionable, or that bringing about consequences is the wrong way of approaching ethics, right? Somebody else might think that that's like clearly the right way to go. And James thinks that there's no way to prejudge now which is the right approach. Maybe 50 years from now you might have a worked out theory and a worked out objection. Like, one might be totally refuted, the other one might be in this very sophisticated form. That's the result of differences in our intellectual temperaments and us believing on that basis ahead of time. So I think you're right. It's sort of you might think you might be posing an objection here, right? If we just have random variation, like somebody might have some wild, crazy, like why should we trust? Like if my belief is just totally on the basis of my arbitrary, inborn intellectual hunch, why should we waste money and time on our hunches? No?
It was an objection.
Oh, okay.
I was just trying to understand because it feels like I'm not much swings in me. Like and like I feel not safe.
Good.
But like if anyone doesn't have any hunch, that means we cannot find truth at all.
Yep.
So like they are basically kind of gone like chances.
Yeah, so James actually does, so James is weirdly obsessed with masculinity. And at first he thinks, and he sort of says, so when he talks about Clifford, he says, your hunch is that evidentialism is true, that you should only believe things on the basis of sufficient evidence, and that by believing on the basis of evidence, there'll be a steady march towards, he's like, great, go do that, right? Like that's your, but I think you're just being a coward, right? I understand that mine's the more manlier view, that you have to take the risk, that like people are risking being wrong, that I'm going to believe my hunch and follow through on it, and that there's uncertainty of whether I'm even on the right track, and we don't know if we'll get, so I think, you mentioned like that's risky, and I think James actually, I mean, subjectively, I think that's part of what appeals to him, and he sort of accuses Clifford of, he calls this sort of like a cowardly view, but like if you're, he talks about the self-fulfilling beliefs a lot. So he says he thinks Clifford would die on a mountaintop, right? Because he's like, I don't know if I can make that jump or not. Since I can't get sufficient evidence whether I can make that jump, I'm just not going to believe I can, and so I won't try, right? Whereas James thinks that the like sometimes the person who's willing to risk being wrong can believe on the basis that they need to believe. Try making the jump. It'll either be made true or won't be made true. They'll find out as they're falling down or they're landing on the other side. But so he thinks that the evidentialist he thinks that his conception of the progress of inquiry does involve this sort of risk, open-endedness, uncertainty. Yeah.
But like the idea of hypothetical wideness.
Oh yeah, theoretical wide hypotheses.
Yes, that's sort of like a solution to that problem.
Well, so the idea that eventually we make in the philosophy department here, right? You've got I assume a pretty wide variety of people working like philosophical worldviews, right? And the way we make progress is we accept all of them into like an anarchist marketplace of ideas, right? And hopefully one of them is on the right track. So the way you make, there is no way to be sure that we all have the true beliefs now, we all have the right account. If we did try to restrict ourselves to what we have good evidence or good arguments for, our sort of set philosophical beliefs would be a very small number of things, and we would not be, we wouldn't be teaching classes on weird, like Hegel, right? And Hegel might be right about the world, right? But if we were to follow Clifford's proposal, James thinks that we would be forced to cut Hegel classes and no one should be writing a dissertation on Hegel. Like maybe we'll be led back to him, like working on the areas of research that we better understand and have better argument for. Maybe after 300 years we'll be led back to him. Maybe not. I think James thinks we'll never make real progress. What we need is bold worldviews, and someone work, following through on them on these sort of hunch basis. So you're right that the way he tries to deal with the riskiness is by diversity, right? By having an open market, an anarchistic open marketplace of ideas. Yeah.
This openness to these different worldviews or different scientific theories, there is a sense of, let them all run their programs and time will tell.
Yeah.
But when it comes to belief in God, this time will tell thing is absent, right?
I think
there must be some asymmetry from having this approach to scientific theories to having wide scientific theories. I mean, this translation from one to the other, where does it leave the approach to scientific theory? Do you understand my question? I'm not able to.
So I think that one of the results I think of my reading of James is that if you take the paper to be a defense of a certain view of inquiry, then his use of the will to believe to defend religious belief, I think, is strained. He's like, I don't see how this a defense of religious belief falls out of this. I think it kind of is it's a little bit of a leap here. Like at the end, he says these things about how he thinks maybe religious belief is justified by seeing how religious believers succeed or fail. Maybe God will reveal himself. I think he thinks, so talk about his defense of parapsychology, right? So he's a believer of religious experience. He's like, I think that Clifford is too quickly dismissing, science is too quickly dismissing religious experiences and religious revelation, right? He thinks that maybe there's something there. We haven't really given it a shot. These people are assuming that materialism, they're assuming there can't be a God, they're assuming that science is sort of, Newtonian physics has revealed the world just to be a mechanistic. But maybe like there is something to these religious experiences that we should be investigating and taking seriously. So that might be one way. So I don't think he thinks that, he's not guaranteeing that that's actually going to work out, but he thinks that maybe, right? He thinks that his hunch is that it will. And that's why I think he supports this sort of parapsychology in journals. The other aspect of it is, though, James thinks that believing in God is, so one is he thinks that maybe investigating religious experiences will work out. Maybe having people who are religious believers in physics, they'll actually do better physics and find God in the atom somewhere. I remember I had a guy at a CD store when I was a kid try to convince me that God exists because Christianity has a trinity and the atom has a proton, a neutron, and an electron. So maybe somewhere in physics there'll be a revelation like we'll find God. But I think James is, what's really pushing him quite a bit here is the problem of evil, oddly enough. He thinks that evil exists. He thinks that there's suffering in the world, that when a child dies and a parent is mourning their loss, that's a really terrible tragedy. So that leads him at first to reject religion. His father is a pastor and who believes that God is perfect, omnipotent, creator of everything, so everything in the universe is perfect. So his father thinks that we live in the best of all possible worlds. And so at first James adopts the view of his father and sort of sees caring about morality, caring about evil as being anti-God, as being heresy. Like if you really believe in a perfect God, you should see everything as being as God intended. And so don't cry, don't get sad, don't feel like you need to fight to stop evils. So so eventually he abandons that. He says, oh, no, evil's real. Evil's real. So he becomes an atheist. And I think he sort of jumps really hard into this sort of scientific worldview of like Clifford, where he's like, determinism is true, God doesn't exist, we don't have free will. He's a utilitarian though. He thinks that evil, he thinks that this view gets him the ability to recognize evil. But eventually he thinks that the scientific view doesn't recognize evil either, because in a world of determinism, the bad things happening couldn't be different, and evil implies could be different, and I could change, and I have the freedom, and it's not just that suffering exists, it's that it feels like an obligation for him to mourn it and to try preventing it, and that the world could be better and doesn't have to be bad. Like he thinks that recognizing evil involves the idea that we can change the world. And so then he starts to think that this sort of view of science, that he adopted after he abandoned his father's view, also can't make room for the existence of evil. So then he gets really suicidally depressed for a couple years. And he finally reads this Kantian French. The book's in French. I haven't read it, but it's a Kant scholar, and he defends a belief in free will on general Kantian grounds that somehow it's a precondition of agency. I think James misinterprets him here, but James comes away from that book being like, I can have faith. I'm just going to have faith in free will, and I'm going to believe it for a year and just see what happens. I'm going to commit to, and I think that's the inspiration for this sort of view, because he then kind of gets out of his depression. He gets a new vitality, and he's able to he actually takes life as meaningful. He's able to do things to help his friends. He's able to be productive in life. He's able to make moral contributions to the world. So he starts to think, well, I experimented by adopting this belief in free will, and it seemed to power my will, right? Enable me to do things and change the world. So that's sort of self-fulfilling for him. But also, it sort of worked, right? This sort of worldview seemed to whereas the other worldviews were causing me to die. One was, and it allowed him to sort of embrace the common sense experience of evil in the world. He's like, yes, this evil does exist. And so I think at first he sort of adopts a belief in free will as an experiment, and then it sort of works for him and leads him to be energized, which he thinks is using his will. It's kind of self-fulfilling, but also it just allows him to recognize what he thinks is an empirical datum, which is that evil is real and that we have an obligation to stop it. Later on, he gets really depressed again, I guess, because of the world that science reveals that the Earth is some speck in some corner of the, some random corner of the universe, and eventually the Earth will go out of existence, and then the heat death of the universe will leave no record of us. So he starts to feel like we're really, so now suffering, evil doesn't exist because Earth is so insignificant. So why do we get so upset that this child died and this mother has to mourn when like we're all going to die anyway and the universe isn't going to remember us? That's when I think he brings back he also, in order to like recognize the existence of evil, he brings in a belief in like a limited God or it really matters that these bad things are happening, and we do have an obligation to stop them because the seen world that's revealed by science is not all there is. There's some sort of unseen aspect to the world where all this matters more, so I think his sort of hunch here is he sort of always sort of wants to believe in God. I think he thinks that evil is real and and is really important, and he needs a belief in the unseen order and of free will. So he's trying to work out a worldview that he can sort of propose on that basis. And then he also sort of takes these sorts of, and maybe he sort of thinks that, well, maybe these religious experiences will be a way for us to prove that that's what's going on. I think I don't really I don't follow him down his like religious direction. I just sort of want to defend the view of philosophy of science. So I guess I want to agree with you that the move from his view of inquiry to defending religion is a bit of a stretch for him. Yeah.
First, sorry, I joined you a little bit late and I missed some words during the first part. My question is about the source of belief. So, for James, believing is basically a part of feeling or the part of rational process?
So he's very behavioristic. I mean, I'm not sure. You have to clarify. But for him, he's pretty behavioristic.
I'm asking this question is if our belief is a part of feeling, we cannot check whether our belief is true or not. But if our belief is a part of rational process, so we can find some evidence to support it's true or it's not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. So I think James thinks that we aren't just sort of driven to certain beliefs when I mean, sometimes I couldn't change my mind about there being chairs in front of me, right? That evidence is coming in my eyes, and I believe that there are chairs. So sometimes the evidence just sort of determines my belief for me. But he also thinks that there's all sorts of things that I'm inclined to believe, or I already believe, not governed by evidence, right? There are people who are raised to believe in God, or raised to believe in the goodness of the universe, or raised to believe in, because of the community they're a part of, or maybe just because to me, determinism makes no sense, or determinism has to be true. The universe just has to be, I can't understand how something could happen randomly. So there's lots of features, we have different ones. Each of us have different beliefs that, even in absence of sufficient evidence, kind of call upon our that we're sort of attracted to believing, and we have to actively fight it if we want to force ourselves just to stick to the evidence. So he makes a distinction in this paper he calls live or dead hypotheses, and he thinks that if a belief is dead, if I have no evidence of it, and I don't have a natural inborn attraction to it, to just think it's true, there's no way I can adopt a faith in it, right? So he's really talking about beliefs are either established by the evidence or because I have an inborn intellectual attraction towards it. Yeah. He's concerned. You're right that he criticizes, or he talks a good bit about how you can't make yourself believe something that unless you have either evidence or just intrinsic, inbornly, by temperament, you're just sort of, it seems plausible, it strikes you as plausible. I have lots of students who just how could determinism not be true, right? I think he thinks Clifford here, he thinks that Clifford's attraction to evidentialism and sort of the idea that epiphenomenalism, he thinks that Clifford just finds it spooky to think that their consciousness could be changing things in the physical, could be having effects in the physical world, or that the physical world isn't deterministic, or that we should believe something without sufficient evidence. So he thinks that like all that is actually part of Clifford's sort of starting intellectual temperament that was inborn. And James says, good, follow that. I'm glad that you have these. Like if we only believed on the basis of evidence, we wouldn't get very far. What we need is lots of people who have inborn tendencies to attractions to in different directions.
Thank you.
I'm gonna give one more example. So the ontological argument, right? Ainsley's ontological argument, right? You might find, oh, that's just wordplay, that's silly, there's no way that argument could work. There's other people who like, Plantinga, who's like, oh, this will work, I just need to put it in modal logic terms, and then like develops large portions of modal logic trying to make it work. So you can imagine just, we need people who like read this argument, some people find it plausible, like on the right track, and some people don't. And it's nothing about the argument, right? If we were just responding, we'd all have the same response to it if we had the same, but instead he thinks there's just variations and something about us inborn, our starting set of intuitions, our starting set of temperaments, lead us to respond to the same evidence in different ways. And that's important to how we make progress.
Sorry, the following question. James, does he differ from believing from knowing? Well,
Yeah.
So you're an expert on Kant philosophy.
Yeah.
So Kant actually differ knowing from thinking, maybe. So you believe actually without knowing.
Yeah.
But you cannot, you cannot justify with some special temporal evidence your belief. Just believe. But when you know, you need to justify it with some special temporal evidence. Like this,
Yeah.
does he differ believing from knowing, or?
I think he thinks, I mean, he doesn't make that distinction explicitly, but I think he could say something like, I believe that there are chairs in front of me, and I have sufficient justified evidence, so I know it. But I believe that Kantian ethics is the right approach, but but whether that's true or not, like whether I know that, that's going to come later, once me and a bunch of philosophers over the next 100 years have done our work, like developing the argument better. So I think he thinks that in some cases knowledge comes, after you have to adopt the belief first, and that leads you to eventually be able to develop and build the evidence and find it, right? Sometimes the evidence requires a 5-decade-long research program. Now maybe I think he's optimistic that we will find out if God exists, and that if we have free, like at the end of philosophy, or in 200 years, we're going to have more developed philosophical views, and we'll have a better picture of how the world works and whether determinism is true or not, or whether what consciousness is, whether God exists, whether there's an unseen afterlife or something like that. So I think he's optimistic that we will have evidence, but the only way we're going to get to that is if we do the science now, and the science now depends on us believing and running in different research directions without knowing which one's going to work out.
Then, isn't it problematic that we believe first, then look for the evidence? It's like self-fulfilling prophet, and we will be more biased when chasing for the evidence.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems, I think, with James's view. I'm presumably going to die before we figure out the complete ethics, right? So I have this hunch that Kantian ethics is on the right track. I'll write some papers defending it. I'll try to respond to some objections, and then I'll die. So I'll die without ever knowing, I suppose, right? But I think James has sort of a community-based view here, right? Whether the community gets to the right answer in the end is going to depend upon me adopting this view, someone else adopting a utilitarian view. So you're right. Each individual might be deluded right? They're going to spend their whole life believing something and actually maybe writing their arguments in a biased way. They're like, communism is wrong for these reasons, and my view is right for these reasons. And their arguments might be biased. But the idea is that the community of inquirers will make progress going forward and is not biased by all these individuals having their own, like, what do I want to say, their own assumptions, right?
Okay, it's like even if it's biased, there will be different views, but at the end we will find the true one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you for this talk. It was very informative. It was really exciting. And so I had a couple of questions, but I will ask you the most pushing one for me. So it was really interesting to hear about this account of self-fulfilling belief,
Yeah.
or this what you call evidence accessing belief. I didn't know I don't know if there are other philosophers who talk about this thing explicitly. I think it's a genuine thing. I think it's a genuine phenomena. But I want to ask you about what the nature of it. So what do you think is the nature of such evidence accessing beliefs? And I will give you, so we can say, so let's assume that evidence accessing beliefs are real, or self-fulfilling beliefs are real. They are a reality that we experience. So what would justify such a thing? In James' view or in your view, I think it could go like, I don't know, at least 3 ways. We can say self-fulfilling beliefs are justified psychologically. If we change our thoughts, it changes our frame of reference in our outlook of the world. We can discover new things, we can recognize new things. So it's like a purely psychological thing. Or we can say it's like a methodological thing. If we consider science, we need like, as you said, in order to be able to discover such complex truths, we need this as a methodology. We need like the hypothesis of a conviction in the hypothesis to pursue it for some time. When we proceed with the belief or faith in God or such things, then I think you go into the territory of the nature of self-fulfilling belief as being ontological or metaphysical.
Yeah.
So your belief in something really determines what reality is, in a way. And someone can give an objection to your position and say, no, the belief in, evidence accessing beliefs in science and evidence accessing in, religion are two separate things. One is like methodological, and the other is even ontological. I wonder what you think about this.
I think James is being very messy here, and I don't think it's clear in his head what he wants to say. And I think there's an objection to be made here to James's argument. But I'll tell you my best attempt to try understanding what. So I think he thinks methodologically science should work this way, and but what's driving him, I think, is this idea. I'll come back to this like recognition of evil, right? When there are people who are starving to death who we can help, their starving matters. It matters a lot in a way that justifies him caring a lot, feeling suicidal that he's not helping, feeling really motivated to like cut luxuries out of his life to go help, to cry and weep over their deaths, right? He thinks taking life seriously seems plausible to him, right? He thinks that like just dismissing the way in which the determinist might dismiss these moral responsibilities and these evils, that's just the pre-programmed parts of the world and they can't be changed. The way that his father dismisses it because it's just a part of God's perfection. He's like, no, these are the wrong worldviews. Like these things matter. We have to fight them and they're real evils. And we can make it better. We can improve, we can overcome these terrible evils and I think he thinks that part of having that worldview is believing in your own free will. And part of having that worldview is believing that these things matter in contrariness to the world as it's been revealed to us by science, where the earth is going to go out of existence and we're all going to die and be insignificant and there's going to be the heat death of it. So he thinks he needs some sort of godly, spiritual realm that we're a part of to care. I find it a little objectionable, right? I think a child starving to death is terrible in itself, and you don't need a grander order for it to matter. But James seems to. And James takes, I mean, in some sense, James takes epistemologically, he's like, that matters a lot. To matter a lot, it can't matter a lot in the universe I see around us. The science, so there must be more to this where that does matter a lot, where human suffering plays an important role. So a religious view, I think, gives, you know, where there's a God who cares about us, and he thinks it can't be a perfect God, because then that would conflict with morality. So there must be some sort of limited God who's fighting evil alongside us and cares that this child died, and it matters that I do the right thing and help. So I guess for him, the self-fulfillingness here is, I mean, God's existence is self-fulfilling in the sense that if we're going to overcome these significant evils and be motivated to fight them, to take them seriously and fight them, as we need to believe that there is a God. Like, so it's what's self-fulfilling is our moral success, right? That we defeat real evils, and a belief in God is a precondition of having the motivation to take evil seriously and fight it. I think that's the way in which ultimately James thinks that God, the belief in God doesn't come into existence because we believe in him, but the belief in him is a part of this worldview that accomplishes moral goods in the world. And our moral success in the world depends upon it. So I think the self-fulfillingness is like slightly located somewhere different. But God is a part of a world, like, in order for a better world to be created, one where we take evils seriously and to think that we can change it and that it's important for us to overcome it, is a worldview that he thinks requires a belief in God. Maybe he doesn't require it. Science could have revealed a world where you wouldn't need a God, right? There was just the Earth. There were no other planets. The star, you know, like there's only like 1 million people on Earth, and we were all immortal. And whenever a child died, the sun dimmed, and like the oceans cried. I think he thinks that in our present universe, we just seem not to matter. Like, we seem so insignificant. So he's sort of introducing a God, I think, to try to make human drama, human life more important, so that he can recognize what he wants to recognize, which is that human suffering is a terrible tragedy that we need to fight. Does that answer your?
Yeah. So, in fact, you said there might be like a fourth justification for this concept of self-fulfilling beliefs, which may be ethical.
He says, like, Clifford. So Clifford, when he's calling Clifford a coward, which he likes to do, he also calls it, like, the religious view of his father kind of cowardly, right? There's all this suffering in the world, and maybe we can't overcome it, and maybe so let me just believe it doesn't really exist, and everything will be all right. And he thinks Clifford is a coward because Clifford's so afraid of being wrong and requires evidence before he believes anything. But he says, like, no general ever wins a war by requiring knowledge that he's going to win before he enters battle, right? And so he thinks that, maybe we're not in a real battle. Maybe this child's suffering doesn't matter. Maybe it's not important that I overcome it. Maybe it's all determined. He's like, but if it is real and it does matter, then if I don't take it as real and fight it, then we've lost this battle. Like, so the victory here, the moral victory, is self-fulfilling, and requires a belief that the evil's real, and a part of the evil being real is believing in free will, and that it's significant in a way that our universe, as revealed to us, doesn't make it significant. So that's why I think he ends up bringing in a God. So I think there is like kind of a moral argument here.
Yeah, it sounds like radical responsibility, or even it sounds existentialist in a way, because you have to, it stems from ethical responsibility, but that's the responsibility that we commit ourselves, we create in a way.
I find it weird that James requires, I don't know, like the fact that he takes a child's suffering to matter so much, right, that he's willing to adopt whole worldviews to but then it doesn't matter unless a God cares about it. It's not enough that this kid's hanging and crying on their So metaphysically, I find, like, in Euthyphro kind of ways, I find his view of morality objectionable, because I think that we don't need to have despite, we live on a small rock off in the corner, but that doesn't make our suffering not matter, whereas I think James, for some reason, seems to think it does make, to be something that matters and is significant is something you realize by noticing its place in the universe and how central it is. and how long it lasts, and I'm like, that's not how significance. I think not how significance works.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Living is something it means that as active is then the COVID is come. When it's for the correct it's not coming and delivering in something that is wrong, the problem. What happens? It makes us unhappy. Then it will be a disappointment, something for us.
Yeah. So.
Being neutral on the way, maybe.
Yeah. So I'm working Kantian ethics. Maybe I'm wrong, and utilitarians are right. And maybe we find out who's right before I die, and I realize that I've kind of wasted my life going in this direction, and all my arguments have failed. I read the new book on utilitarianism that everyone's been talking about, and I'm like, wow, this is right. I've been on the wrong track this entire time. All of my arguments fail. That would be. I would realize I'm wrong. I feel like I wasted my time. I feel like I was a fool. But the only way that we got the book on utilitarianism was somebody following that hunch, right? So I think he thinks that we're not going to make progress unless we have some people daringly willing to take the risk of being a fool and being wrong. And he thinks that, Clifford is, so Clifford, he thinks, is this sort of safe view of never having to risk being proven wrong. But he thinks that that's not the view that's going to make, that has ever driven very much progress. Now, you might think that the Clifford's view is the way you get progress, right? Science proceeds because they care about evidence, and they don't just subjectively believe what they want to believe, right? They follow where the evidence leads. And James is like, no, the way science proceeds is you get a lot of people with faith and they care about the evidence, but the faith is a very important part. And the willingness to be, to follow a hunch and be proven wrong. So I mean, James is not going to say, I'm glad there's a Clifford in the world because we do need some, because maybe he's right? That's also, he thinks the evidentialism is a hunch too. And that and Clifford's intellectual temperament is, I think he thinks it's a fear of being wrong that's kind of driving him. But to success in battle comes the person who is willing to risk defeat before knowing whether you'll succeed or not. And similarly, he thinks is the case in the sciences and philosophy.
Okay. We don't have any other questions? So we can thank our speaker.